Good afternoon, everybody. Well, I'm really glad that Rama came before me and sort of deconstructed the whole idea of language for us. And I agree with a lot of what is said. Yes, we avoid. In fact, in one of my lecture, also in a paper where we argued this. I've taken some slides from my Kriya lecture, so that is still there. I'm really sorry. But in that lecture, what I was also talking about is that why we should avoid using capital L and use small l for everybody, and also prefix multi, putting within bracket, because all languages are multilingual repertoire. And the history of language tells you sufficiently, and history of our own ontogenetic and cultural evolution provides evidence for languages being fundamentally multilingual repertoire if we draw a boundary between languages. We need this term multilingual because we operate with some boundaries, and whenever we talk in terms of identities, identity boundary is necessary. I am this and I'm not her. I'm obviously drawing a boundary. So giving name to a language and distinguishing it from another speech form or speech variety requires this reification. And so this reification creates also conceptual problems that Rama was talking about. Well, I complicate some of the things where I don't entirely go with Rama. I mean, I don't disagree. What I'm saying that I complicate some of the ideas a little more, which you'll find here and in my talk. Okay, what I'll do now is, because Rama has now deconstructed language as multilingual, and centrally places multilinguality as a unique human capacity. I will do a bit of psychology because he's a linguist, he did enough, but I'll not bore you. I'll do a bit of psychology which will help us, because we are going to talk about pedagogy, which is a space between people and which is fundamentally a mediated space where we bring in several conceptual metaphors or categories and physical tools to talk about and talk through. And if this space is to be discussed, I have to do a bit of psychology, because this space is populated by people and also by all kinds of conceptual and material objects that we have around. In other words, it is fundamentally a cultural space. And how do we understand that pedagogic space? It requires a bit of psychology. So what I'll do is, this is part of, we did a multilingual education study. During that study, I came across of some of the observations in Delhi. And this is an excerpt from our Urban Emily project. Now, this was done in 2012, sorry. And then I revisited it in 2018, 2019. You go to slum schools, schools close to poor neighborhoods in Delhi. Many of the children are doing less well or badly in language education, in mathematics, and other subjects. In other words, they fail in these subjects. And we talk in that language that children fail in children from the slums or poor neighborhood fail in mathematics or do not do as well in mathematics or language or science. And then this is one excerpt which talks about enormous amount of cognitive capabilities that the children have before going to school. They don't require school to develop this. And schools should be doing something more. If schools are not doing, then schools are not doing. And they don't have to be, they shouldn't be there. If school teaches what the community or the grandmother does, then schools, we don't need schools. In fact, we're better off without schools. So I'll just read it out, because 2-3 things I'll show, and then I'll situate my dialogue in that. An urban poor is also a migrant, a multilingual, speaking languages other than English, and is often from a community with rich oral and affective resources, but less print resource. She constantly struggles with languages and multiple other semiotic resources, such as road signage systems, writings on the shops, food items, buses. We observe some Bihari children, also some there were also some Odia children in Basan Bihar slum where we were doing our study, and how they were constantly multilanguaging or translanguaging. She translates as well as code switches. I'm using code switching because the children actually talk about languages, giving using the names, and also we're distinguishing between languages. And they were saying that, I'm using 2 or 3 languages. So I'm continuing with this word code switching. And I don't question Ramakant's position on what language is. If language gets a broader definition of that, kind, code switching is not a tenable phenomenon. I'm operating with more identity-oriented categories here, and therefore code switching is very much conceptually tenable. She translanguages as well as code switches depending on the linguistic familiarity and identity of the interlocutor. When the child goes to a shop, if the shopkeeper is a Haryanvi and the child is from South, just observe how the child talks, brings in some words that both of them understand, indicates at something, uses a lot of gestures. So child is constantly multi-languaging or translanguaging to communicate, because that's primary, desire of the child. She constantly translates to reduce the burden of mutual comprehension on other speakers, including adult speakers. Adults have to understand me because I need that object. I need to buy. She stores a number of lexical categories, metaphors, linguistic cues, and other grammatical items like phonetics on a working memory and attends to them swiftly when needed. Her metalinguistic awareness is high. Her intersubjective resources are agentic. Just look at them, how they just walk around, how they approach a person, how do they point at something, what words they bring in. If their words are not understood, what more they do in that. That's an extremely rich intersubjective plane where they are constantly direct each other's attention to an object about which she was trying to talk about. And so it generates a lot of these intersubjective and affective resources, and those resources are certainly agentic. But this child fails. Nobody asks whether she fails or school fails her. So what I did here is that we conceptualized a term called multilingual intelligence, and where we basically we drew on a lot of cognitive science literature that shows when children operate with multiple languages and operate in an extremely diverse and equally resource constrained context, So there is diversity here. There are also constraints created by that diversity in certain domains. So in one domain there may be error, but in another domain the same thing may not work. So there is always a kind of constraint I'm encountering in a real everyday situation. So the diversity and the constraints create a different kind of cognitive challenge for the child. So this child has to keep more languages in working memory, has to constantly switch between languages, also sometimes knows what kind of switching or mixing will help better communicate, holding on to information and constantly interpreting the intentions of others, like what the other person want to hear. Did you understand? All this create higher cognitive abilities. So do schools develop pedagogy on this more advanced cognitive skills? So what I argued after this is that, the children have very evolved multilingual intelligence, which is about, Lina and others will say a little more about cognitive functioning, higher level of cognitive functioning, executive functions, and also the fluidity, the cognitive fluidity with which they operate. And these are needed for success in classroom. Okay, so in other words, multilingual children are cognitively and emotionally better suited for education. Whereas everything that a child has is turned against, works against that child. So the pedagogy is about what the school should not be, or the classroom should not be doing, or what it should do that it is not doing at the moment. I'll not go through it. We had done this study sociolinguistic survey in 1996-97 or 98, I think, in Odisha. Then we did in Rajasthan, we did in Madhya Pradesh, Rama, and all of you have done, in several places. We show that Indians, wherever they are, whether they're in rural area, urban area, tribal area, non-tribal area, doesn't matter, they constantly multi or trans-language. Okay, I distinguish these two terms, multi or trans-language. Rama doesn't have to distinguish, but I'm a psychologist, so I'm distinguishing between these two because, like when the child grows up in a multilingual society and hears others speaking, and that's how the child acquires language, what Rama was saying. The child is developing one single multilingual repertoire, and as the child has some grammatical structure using which the child makes meaningful sentences, and when others understand those sentences and reciprocate, okay, in terms of response, the child knows that, okay, that's right. And the child doesn't make, and that's where, linguists say that, we are wired for it. That's another debate. I'm not getting into that today. But the child is operating a single multilingual repertoire. But as mind social identity studies show that by the time the child is 4-year-old, child has developed awareness about his gender, about his caste, many social structural variables that position them differently in relation to society and to each other, to people around them. So the child also gets a sense that, okay, this is how it is said in Odia, but not in Bengali. My cook was a Bengali. We spoke Odia, Hindi, and English because we were in Delhi. My son grew up hearing all these languages, but my son also gradually developed this understanding that this is not how we say in Odia, but this is how we say in Bengali. The child, so it starts with a single repertoire, which is multilingual. And if you are not talking in terms of languages, then translanguaging is not a concept that we should be using. We all language. Why do you say trans? Because you are saying that, okay, there are languages, so you are either interlanguaging or multilanguaging or translanguaging. So what is implicit in this category is this acknowledgement of multiple languages. And being a psychologist, I'm telling you, I can defend my argument. The child is obviously starting with a single multilingual repertoire without exception, and then gradually developing awareness about boundaries, about conventions, about registers. And then the child also develops a social intellectual sense of where to use, how to use, and that's when the child multi-languages, and that is where the cognitive effort becomes deliberate. Translanguaging is spontaneous. Multilanguaging is obviously deliberate. In classroom, our own studies in both in Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh shows that in classrooms we see use of both the kinds of languages. Like children, so motor translanguage. They also, when they also know if it is a mathematics class, how to employ language. Whether to employ more Hindi or more Magahi or more Bhili, or I should not be using Bhili more here, but maybe, Rajasthani, what is that language I'm forgetting? Marwadi. Marwadi will still work. I can use little more Marwadi. That is acceptable, but not so much of Bhili. And also in exams, I will use Hindi language. And therefore, so there is so much of deliberate work, I mean, employment of languages happening. I cannot therefore defend. Of course, the translingual scholars use the term deliberate translanguaging. They came up with this later, and I don't know how do they define that, because trans is about boundaryless. And deliberate is about boundary. I'm a psychologist. And if I'm talking about how mind works, how the cognitive faculties are used, I really do not know how to defend this. And this term was used way later in 2018 or so, 2017 or 18. This deliberate translanguaging, to advance it as a more, as a superordinate, as a more inclusive category, and everything else comes under that. And that's where they had to explain both the kinds of linguistic behavior, and therefore they distinguished between deliberate and spontaneous translanguaging. Translanguaging is, boundaryless. So anyway, so why I'm saying this is that I don't want to get into too much on this translanguaging or deliberate, spontaneous or deliberate translanguaging or multilanguaging. I prefer multilingualism and translanguaging a little more. I don't reject translanguaging. But as I'm saying, translingual scholars also have to understand that boundaries are there. Otherwise, you don't. Anyway, so what I wanted to say is that what is normal is this politician addressing a crowd outside, and look how the politician using language. Same was the case in classroom as well. The children bring multiple languages to classroom in order to be comprehensible to each other. So what is normal, what is natural, we do not build on. So using monolingual practice is basically a political decision that we have made. And so, if you want to change it, please make a political decision as well. But this is not natural, and NEP is taking some political position on this. Okay, what I'll do here, my second half of my lecture will be on pedagogy a bit more. I'll try to draw on 3 major experiments we did in Odisha. We worked in other states, but I'll be drawing more on from my Odisha work. What do schools do? This is a very fundamental question that Vygotsky asked in 1920s and 30s when he was asked to develop a kind of pedagogic system for a newly formed Marxist government, because they wanted to discontinue with the earlier one and they wanted a new theory of literacy. And what does Vygotsky say, which is very central to our project here, is that if school education does what a grandmother does or a community does, then we don't need schools. So schools have to do something more. And what is that? That is where he talked about, he gives a theory of knowledge, and he talks about, okay, we are born into a very, very artifactually evolved world, and these artifacts are developed because of our own interventions, and that constituted culture. So in this culture, you have chairs, you have laptop, you have bike, you have everything, and these have evolved because of our own our intervention. And that intervention was possible because we have what he calls mirror neuron, because of which we can actually develop or understand others' mind. So if I am sitting in that chair and I'm finding it a little bit uncomfortable, so I start thinking, okay, the person who made this chair, why didn't it do something more so that I get better back support? And so if I want to redesign the chair, I'll tell the carpenter, what you do is that put a little curve kind of thing there, that touches my back, so that my back gets support. And the carpenter does, and then maybe my sister says, no, it's a bigger curve. You need a smaller one, or you need a cushioned one. What is happening? That chair is there, but I'm able to think in terms of somebody's mind, what the mind could be behind making a chair like this. And then I'm saying, okay, I can change this much. And then my sister comes, looks at that, and changes it a bit more. All artifacts, whether they're conceptual or material, have evolved through this route because we could collaboratively engage with a knowledge. And that is how the knowledge has developed. Part of it is in oral traditions, a lot of it is canonized, and a lot of it is also sort of embedded in the objects that we have created, and we can discover those knowledge by unpacking in whatever tool methods we employ. So what do schools do? Schools basically create capacity in us to engage in those evolved cultural knowledges or artifacts and then be part of that dialogue. So if there is knowledge of science or mathematics or linguistics, I should be able to participate in that knowledge and enhance. Okay. If the school is not doing it, then school is not doing anything. To talk about a little more, I would like to say something else. Like, how do we think? If I run a small experiment here, I ask you to think about something and tell me without employing language. Will you be able to do? Take 1 minute and report me your thought without employing language. You are not allowed to think without employing language and also report without employing language. It's nearly impossible in the post-linguistic phase because every object has a word and we think through those words, But then a child who hasn't developed language, does that child think or not? So the child can think through image. We also think through image. Okay. Image is part of the larger semiotic system. I'm talking about language, the spoken language. Okay. We still cannot think without a semiotic tool. It's fundamentally mediated. Thinking is mediated. So, but it's possible. If I ask you to think without employing a concept, whether that concept is in language or in some image or anything, we'll not be able to think. That's impossible. So thinking requires concepts. So what does school do? When the children come to us, children come with a lot of concepts, a lot of ideas. They are not empty slates. The schools have to build knowledge on those. But what kind of concepts schools provide? Vygotsky calls that scientific concepts. Yeah, I'll take 5 minutes. So what does Vygotsky say is that the schools need to provide some theoretical, more abstract scientific concepts which can be built on children's everyday concepts, but then these concepts once developed reorganizes the mind of the child. In other words, reorganizes the knowledge of the child. That's the primary goal of school education. Teaching language is probably one of the smaller goals of school education. So the question is, how do we teach children all this? If multilingual rapporteur helps us teach children better, more abstract concepts, we don't have time. I just won't be going into all this. Okay, I mean, you can read on your own. I'll just, okay.
Let's just for one of those experiments, Minati, before you, when you said there are 3, no? Maybe there's no time.
No, I have 4 or 5 minutes, not 3 or 4 minutes. Let me just look at it so that I know what to say. Okay. One thing is that some of the ground rules are, because we multi-language, we also multi-knowledge. As we talk about one object and different people, different students bring different linguistic resources to talk about that object, they're also bringing multiple knowledge systems to the classroom. And diversity, without exception, is at the core of learning. All these 3 experiments that we did, RI, multilingual education and multilingual education plus, in all these 3 experiments, what we did was we took the linguistic and the cultural diversity of the classrooms, used them as resources, and then taught try to engage with, not taught, try to engage with some linguistic concepts or mathematical concepts or physical concepts. The beauty of RI, this is what Rama and I used to discuss, lied in one thing. Rama didn't know Odia, knew English and Hindi. Saura teachers knew Saura language and Odia and bit of Hindi. I knew Odia, very little Saura. Mahendra Mishra knew Odia, but had a better rapport with Saura teachers, Odia and English. But when we did those workshops and we developed the textbook, the teachers developed the textbooks, which we sort of engaged with them academically so that they developed those textbooks. We did not find any problem in communication. That's because right from the beginning, we accepted the multilinguality to be our mode of communication. That's our biggest evidence in 1996, 97, 98, that a multilingual project is possible. And this also addresses the myth that if the teachers do not know every child's home language, that is not a disadvantage. On the contrary, that is an advantage because you allow or you encourage students and yourself to translanguage or translate or transliterate or use all of the semiotic resources to communicate, which is needed for good education. Multilingual education, we did, the state tried in tribal areas where we used a lot of, also in all these three projects, we used a lot of students' knowledge and concepts in developing the classroom, the teaching learning materials, and then we use them to teach. Okay, there are many things I won't be able to say. Okay, one thing I'll just talk about Multilingual Education Plus, of course. We use a lot of, okay, let me just come to one. Suppose in mathematics classroom or in science classroom, whenever we talked about, say, number system or base value or, say, a magnet, we wanted to engage with this concept of magnet. What we did is we brought in children's metaphors or the regular metaphors from their everyday language and use them to attend to some of the mathematical or physical properties. And then we brought more experiences or more examples to talk about it so that that particular idea reifies or develops into a concept. It takes a little time, but some of the metaphors from children's everyday life were used to foreground the physical idea or the mathematical idea, and then we brought in more linguistic resources as well as experiences to help it develop into a concept. Okay, and this is where use of multilingual resources really helped. In mathematics, we often brought in 2-3 kinds of number systems with different base values to talk about how historically base values have helped in developing bigger and more complex number systems, and what is the place of base value in conceptualizing number system. So wherever we have very successful pedagogy, we actually use students' linguistic and diverse cultural resources in the classroom. But that is possible only when the teacher knows the discipline. If the teacher doesn't know what a magnet is, what a number system is, what a base value is, the teacher will not be able to use or will not be able to teach effectively, even if the teacher is bringing more multilingual and cultural resources to classroom. So teachers' knowledge in the discipline is very, very fundamental. I'll stop here. When you ask questions, I can talk about what multiple affordances multilingual classrooms bring for teaching. Thank you.